Hello and welcome to the StoryFutures Academy masterclass for the Arts Council England and Digital Catapult's CreativeXR program. We're delighted to have as our guests this evening, Celine Tricart and Liam Young. Celine Tricart is an acclaimed storyteller who has developed a unique style involving highly emotional stories and strong visual artistry. Her work's been showcased at numerous top-tier festivals, including Sundance, Venice, Tribeca, South by Southwest, and Hot Docs. She's received the Lion for Best Immersive Work at the Venice Film Festival in 2019, the Storyscapes Award at Tribeca in 2019, amongst many other accolades. Celine served as the president of the international jury of the Venice Virtual Reality section at the Biennale Cinema 2020. Her company, Lucid Dreams Productions, specializes in utilizing new technologies to further bold, unapologetic storytelling and empowering female voices in the filmmaking process. Liam Young is a speculative architect and director who operates in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures. He's co-founder of Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, an urban futures think tank, and Unknown Fields, a nomadic research studio. His world building for the film and television industries has been acclaimed in both mainstream and architectural media. He's a BAFTA-nominated producer, and his work has been collected by institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. He now runs the groundbreaking Masters in Fiction and Entertainment at SciArc in Los Angeles, and manages his time between exploring distant landscapes and visualizing the future worlds he extrapolates from them. We're delighted to have you both with us today. I'm really excited to hear what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating talk between the two of you on spatial storytelling, and particularly spatial storytelling as it connects to VR, AR, MR, and any other kinds of R that might be relevant. First of all, Celine, tell us a little bit about your work and the key, your prize-winning film in Venice.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here and with Liam and talk about spatial storytelling, which is something I'm really passionate about. So just a little bit about me. So I'm originally from France, lived in Los Angeles for about 7 years, and my background is in the film industry. So I used to work on movies as a stereoscopic 3D expert. And so since early on in my career, I've always been passionate about utilizing the 3 dimensions of space in order to enhance storytelling. And I pivoted to virtual reality in 2013, 2014. And I started thinking about how we can bring emotional storytelling to that new medium that I find fascinating. So I just want to say I'm also a gamer, and I always thought that virtual reality was kind of like this interesting missing link between filmmaking and gaming. And so I'm also trying to draw inspiration from both for my project. So yeah, I have a little short video that introduces my latest work called The Key. So like Adam said, The Key was premiering at Tribeca Film Festival last year, and is now available for free on the Oculus Store for both Oculus Rift and Oculus Quest. So if you have access to an Oculus headset, please go ahead. You can download it. It's only 15 minutes. Please watch it for yourself. And in the meantime, this is a little intro video of what it's about and what it looked like.
The Key, it's an interactive room-scale virtual reality experience that mixes different medium. We have an installation and some live theater as part of the experience. It's a journey where you get to meet a young woman named Anna. Anna doesn't remember her past, but she thinks that there are clues in her dreams that will help her remember her past. And specifically, there is a key. So we go on a journey looking for what the key is and what it opens.
You made it. You're in. This is the house in the clouds. This is where I come from. This is my home. And this is why I can't come back. I am a refugee.
So that's about the key, and yeah, we've done a lot of we use a lot of the knowledge of, like I said, spatial storytelling coming from environmental storytelling from video game for the key, and so I'm excited to be talking with Liam and Adam today about these aspects of virtual reality. So thank you again for having me.
Great, thank you so much, Celine. And Liam, tell us a little bit about yourself in the same way.
Thanks, Adam. I've put together a short showreel, a selection of clips that I thought might be relevant to help the conversation along today. I'm just going to play that and then talk over the top of it and narrate some of these projects a little bit by way of introduction. I am a speculative architect, and I don't design buildings, but instead I work between documentary and fiction to tell stories about the global and urban implications of technology. And I borrow from the techniques of fiction, film, and performance to collect and visualize stories of landscapes and cities, both real and fictional, to engage audiences with the strange ways that technology is changing our world. My practice is perhaps best described as world building, and we construct worlds for film and television production, or for companies such as Ford or Mitsubishi, or organizations like that are by government, and for our own films, immersive experiences, games, and performances. And in general, our world building begins with a deep engagement with the present moment. Even our speculative narratives begin in our documentary work. In this immersive projection installation called Unraveled, we take audiences behind the scenes of fast fashion. Before we wear them, our clothes make journeys of tens of thousands of miles in their process of production, making textiles the most globalized industry on the planet. This enveloping film installation depicts the sacred procession of a young Indian textile worker who walks slowly through a series of dramatic scenes from her home village amongst the cotton fields to the textile mills and factories of the vast textile industry where she works. Her journey suggests the walk along the fashion catwalk and the path that our disposable fashion takes in its process of global production, and the path so many women like her have taken in moving from village to factory to city, and the path that all of the clothes we wear takes, ending amongst the mega ships that will export them all the way from India to the West. Our speculative narrative experiences depart from this base research, and we project technologies and supply chains into new narratives and engage new technologies of storytelling. This, for example, is how driverless taxis scan the city and reads it as these three-dimensional point clouds. These are scenes from a science fiction experience we've developed called Where the City Can't See, the first narrative film shot entirely using laser scanning technology. It positions the audience within the embodied viewpoint of an autonomous car, seeing the world through the eyes of machine vision systems. And across a single night, a group of young factory workers drift through a future city in a driverless taxi. They're part of an underground rave community that work on the production lines by day, but at night they adorn themselves in machine vision camouflage and the tribal masks of anti-facial recognition makeup to dance in the hidden spaces of the city. And they hack the city, and their iridescent textiles reflect the light of CCTV laser scanners to create exuberant glitches, distortions, and disturbances in the data set, searching for the wild beyond the machines. And in the same way, this live-action immersive performance, Transmissions from the Drone Orchestra, brings audiences into immediate proximity with autonomous drone technology that was previously only associated with military applications. In collaboration with John Cale and the Velvet Underground, we mounted speakers to a flock of choreographed flying machines, and they would act as both disembodied instruments and nomadic audio infrastructure to create an immersive live music performance and visual spectacle that would fade in and out above a seated audience in Barbican Theatre in London. And when I'm not making these personal works, I also run a postgraduate master's program in fiction and entertainment at SciArc, an architectural school in Los Angeles. It's a world-building master's program where students develop fictional worlds in the mediums of VR, games, and animation to create immersive environments and tell new kinds of stories.
Before I knew what it was, race and its divisions were embedded in my daily life.
For example, Feringe is an immersive graphic memoir of mixed-race identity created by American-Ethiopian director Ainsley Robson. It's a VR point cloud dreamscape generated from historic images and personal photographs that are sourced from friends and family in Cleveland, USA, and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. It's an experience that takes audiences through a notion of home that's constructed immaterially via fragments of culture and oral history distorted through the filter of time. And Where the Turtles Fly, a video game experience capturing the story of a young refugee boy who has fallen over the side of a boat. He washes up on the shore of a city that doesn't want him, and with just a phone, his only connection to his loved ones, begins a journey to find a new home. It's created from 3D scans of Beirut, the home city of game designer Andrei Zakiat, and the young boy travels between fantasy and reality, traversing a surreal urban landscape of surveillance drones, watchtowers, and monsters of trash. And I guess I wanted to show these works to set up the way that we approach our projects. I have a background in architecture, and what we do with these fictional worlds is explore the ways that in the context of immersive media, editing is becoming an act of transitioning through space. We are moving away from the frame-to-frame transitions that have defined the first 100 years of cinema and moving towards space-to-space transitions, where an edit becomes an act of virtual architecture, a jump cut through a sequence of designed worlds. The notion of spatial storytelling would seem a useful departure point for today's conversation, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you both very much. That's really exciting. And I guess maybe the first question, perhaps Celine, I'll ask you, like, how would you define spatial storytelling, and how useful a concept do you think it is to telling stories in VR and AR?
I think what's really interesting is how virtual reality is one of those art forms that utilizes all 4 dimensions. So the 3 spatial dimension, because it's stereoscopic by nature, and I would say 6 degrees of freedom, even for the linear cinematic content, and the 4th dimension, which is time. And there's not a lot of arts that utilizes those 4 dimensions. And I think what's interesting is how we tend to think of virtual reality storytelling using the same language as film, for example. While I think also that's something that Liam said in his video, is like how different storytelling for VR is like he mentioned editing. And that's one of the many things that are completely different, because in movies, we are mostly working on the time dimension. We utilize things such as the 3-act structure or the hero's journey, which are all techniques that unravel through time. And in virtual reality, we don't have to, we can, but there are other opportunities to explore. For example, there was a VR experience that I really liked at the 2020 Venice Film Festival, that you have to physically walk through space to unlock the next scene of the story, but the scenes are not in order. So depending on the path you choose and where you walk, you will just have glimpses of scenes, and then you patch them together in your mind. But it's kind of like this non-linear. It's not linear on the time dimension, but it's like you choose your path in the spatial sense, which I thought was a good example for what we're trying to describe here, the spatial storytelling. And also, I do think that it's really valuable to understand the importance of space in storytelling. And I think that's something that video games have really mastered, and they call it environmental storytelling, where if you look around and if you pay attention to the space around you, it will tell you the story in a very passive but organic way. And in VR, where we take, as storyteller, we tend to take a step back in the control that we have over the way the story is being told. We present story elements, but we have to also let our participants, I call the audience in VR participants, patch things together and figure it out themselves. And so that is a very important aspect for VR, is understanding how environments or space can be vectors of storytelling, just as we use a voiceover or dialogue in traditional film.
Thank you very much. Liam, how do you respond to this kind of coming together of 2 different approaches to telling stories spatially?
I mean, just to expand a little bit on my intro, as I mentioned, my background is actually in architecture. Although now we make films and experiences, I still feel like I'm working through an architectural practice when I make these works, because essentially I believe that discipline is very much one of telling stories with space, and in many ways that's the same process that is a part of mixed reality experiences. It's no longer about an unfolding narrative across time, 24 kind of single 2D frames a second stitched together, but rather it's more accurate to potentially use the vocabulary of a discipline like architecture to start to describe how stories unfold, using terms like threshold, scale, spatial sequence, spatial transitions are perhaps more native to a spatial design discipline like architecture than to film, but perfect to start to talk about the way that you move through story, the way that you edit in mixed reality experiences. So I think that we can learn a lot from those spatial disciplines, potentially even more so than we can learn from the traditions of film, to start to think about what it means to design environments, narrative environments for audiences, allowing them space to start to make some of their own decisions, at least deciding where to look, as in the case of 360 video, or in the case of interactive VR, literally deciding how to piece together the stories for themselves. It's a fundamentally different act of cinematography. You know, it's much more an act of architectural design, and it's also a fundamentally different act of writing, you know, where you're giving space for an audience to start to make their own decisions about how to engage with a piece. It requires a whole new tool set. And as I was describing in the intro, like the language of film is developed for over 100 years. As we start to figure out what it could be as a medium, I think we're at the very edge of understanding what that is in mixed reality spaces and experiences, and potentially the history of a discipline like architecture and forms of spatial design can, in a way, do some of that background research for us.
That's fantastic. I mean, I wanted to ask, Celine, you began as a filmmaker. What does filmmaking offer you still in this environment? And maybe what might you need to learn from architecture? And perhaps, Liam, I'd ask you the other way around. You know, you've told us a little bit about what you've learned from architecture or what that offers. Is there still something to learn from film, do you think? Celine, do you want to go first?
I think a lot of things, a lot of my skills from filmmaking still apply to VR storytelling. And I think it all comes down to emotion building, strong connections with others, with characters, and creating an emotional journey. So instead of having the traditional a journey of, okay, this is what's going to happen, is really trying to figure out what is, like, literally draw, as you prepare your piece, literally draw the emotional journey of not your characters anymore, but your participants. And what will people feel and when, and how do you make those emotions evolve throughout the story? And I think that's something that we know very well in film, again, because we are so into this, like the timeline. We're so used to working on those terms of acts and scenes, and so that is something that definitely needs to stay for VR storytelling. But unfortunately, there is a lot of other things that we try to drag with us in VR storytelling that shouldn't be there. And I think that a lot of people doing VR come from film like me. And unfortunately, I think cinema is probably the last thing you should get your inspiration from when you're trying to create VR. I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of enemies after saying something like this, but we have full control. When we make a movie, we have full control over the way the story is being delivered and the way the story is being presented. We have this frame, we control where the area of the field of vision is, we control what's in that frame, what's blurred, what is in focus, and most of this control doesn't exist in VR. So it's very difficult for people coming from film to let go of that full control of the story and of the presentation of the story. And I often say that in VR, we are not a director per se, but we're more like a matador with the red cape, and we wave the red cape and we hope that, participants will be paying attention to what we want them to pay attention, and will be getting what we want them to get from the story. But at the end of the day, we don't control this, and there will always be a small percentage of people who will be what I call the rebels, and they will be looking completely other direction, or understand something completely different, or do something completely different. But we need to create for those people as well, and that's kind of part of that world-building approach that also Liam was describing, of like, we create a world and we make sure that there's things in this world for everyone, and we try to wave the red cape, but eventually it's up to the people to decide. We keep the emotional journey of filmmaking, but we also let go of everything else.
Thanks so much. So yeah, Liam, do you have a red cape?
I don't have a red cape, but I can only agree with Celine. I mean, the hardest thing about making a transition from being an architect into the directing space for me has actually been that crafting of narrative and the writing of story and developing emotional relationships with audiences. It's not something that really you explore in such a meaningful way in architecture, whereas film is really still an extraordinarily powerful emotional medium. You know, we can sit ourselves in a dark theater or at home on the couch and laugh and cry and really be consumed by a narrative arc. And I think that process of imbuing drama into a context is something that we still do so well in film that I think really should come with us in working through these mixed reality experiences. But you know, the tools you have to start to enact that drama, and as Celine describes, the emotional journey that you take audiences on are inevitably slightly different. And I think that's kind of what I'm talking about with the embracing of spatial design disciplines within this context, because it really is a medium without a proscenium. Even cinema as well has a frame, whether it be the curtain that covers a screen that then is unrolled as the trailer starts to play, or the proscenium frame around the stage space. Potentially, you could describe, you know, the strapping of a headset or the ring of rare earth on your eyeballs as a form of proscenium, but that boundary between the audience and content, in most cases, is dissolved.
Can I ask you both about something that we do bring with us from film to VR, which is sound and how sound is used, sound worlds, how sound works in VR or spatial storytelling, because it feels it's quite often neglected, but it's maybe the most spatial sense of them all.
I included in my intro the drone orchestra project that we did with John Cale, where we were attaching speakers to a flock of drones and flying them above the heads of audiences. The speakers were broadcasting the sounds of the band on stage, so you would have John Cale's voice kind of fading into focus above your head and then fading out of focus, and kind of like taking your surround sound system and making it airborne and then spitting it around above you. And it was really a process of trying to think about sound in a very dynamic and architectural way, you know, not fixed within space or locked into the 5.1 of a theater system, but actually being mobile. And in many ways, that's the nature of sound in space. And it can be a really powerful device, I think. You know, we use sound to kind of lead audiences through. Celine talks about the red cape of the matador, but equally following a sound is a really powerful device. Creating apertures in the world design of an experience where you can situate three-dimensional sound, and that sound pours through, draws attention. We look through an opening or a gap. We wander in a particular direction because we seek out that experience. So you're right, it's a really critical layer, and again, it's certainly something from the filmic toolkit, which we can bring with us, because, you know, just like a really clever three-dimensional soundscape can be just as critical in starting to lead audiences through space. In level design in video game, there's a technique called the squint test, which is that if you squint and put your eyes out of focus, you should still, as a player, be able to tell where you should go, right? Because, like, you know, the pathway should be lit in a way that other areas you shouldn't walk aren't. or the geometry of the world, or a kind of a landmark in the distance should be legible even when you're out of focus. And I think you could do the similar sort of thing with a sound test. You should be able to kind of turn the sound off and in a way navigate an experience just by following the sound design. So yeah, it's really critical.
And Celine?
Yeah, well, 100%. In filmmaking, we say it's 50-50, what we see and what we hear, in terms of importance in the way we tell a story. I think in VR, it's actually 60-40, or like in the favor of sound. I think sound is absolutely vital into carrying that spatial storytelling approach. And actually, there's a VR experience that everybody quotes all the time, and it's funny because it was one of the early ones, but it really succeeded into illustrating that point, which is not sound blindness, where you hear the recording or somebody who is going blind and describes how the sound becomes, like if an object or if something doesn't produce sound, it means it doesn't exist. And the only things that do exist are things that make some kind of sound. And so you see through his eyes, as he describes going blind, what the world looks like when it's only created through things that make sound. And I think this is a VR experience that is 5 years old or 4 years old, but it's still like talked about in most of the VR event, because it is so relevant and so obvious that it shows how sound creates a world around us. And for world building and for spatial storytelling, it cannot go. I often find it sad that people start with visuals instead of, they should be starting with soundscapes first, and then figure out what kind of visual is needed that will not be redundant of whatever clues the soundscape is giving you. Soundscape and visualscape should never be giving the exact same information. They should be giving different information, and that offset between the two is what tells the story. And also, yes, we are completely, even though it's a 360-degree world, we are still limited to, most headsets have a 90-degree or 100-degree field of view, and we're still limited in what we see. It's much smaller than our actual vision, but the soundscape is really the same, and we can not only convey direction, but we can also convey distance, which is something that's really hard to do because our distance, our 3D vision is not that great. It's very good between 0 and 10 meters, but then it quickly fades into flatness. While the way we can position distance and object in space through sound is way more precise. We don't think it is, but it is actually more precise. And yes, it is absolutely the red cape when I say it's our role to guide participant through our story. My number one tool that I have in my tool belt as a director is sound, 100%, to tell them, okay, this is where the story is, this is where the interesting thing I want you to look at is. If you don't want to look at it, it's fine, but and for this I'm using sound for sure, number one.
You've both talked about kind of displacement or told stories, maybe trying to kind of tell stories that aren't told or aren't told enough, or kind of getting people to kind of understand the world, how the world is perceived by the displaced, and also how do they connect to spatial storytelling, because you're also telling stories about people who are being displaced.
I think there's a really interesting potential in these mediums to reveal conditions that potentially are hiding in plain sight. Like a lot of these narratives allow us to look back in on a world we think we already know, but to see it with fresh eyes. And a lot of our work is interested in that process of reframing the present, so that we can start to see it for what it really is. And that is in many ways about revealing the invisible. And I think that's a really critical role that a lot of these fictions can start to play. We use the term data dramatization for a lot of our work. Things like the fashion film I showed, Unraveled, these are kind of truths in terms of supply chains of technology or fast fashion that we, to a certain extent, understand. We've seen news stories about them. We can see the mapping of global supply chain routes and shipping lines, and really complex data sets around things like climate change, and data visualization as a design medium traditionally looks to formats that try and find patterns in the data and visualize them so that we can start to read and understand the data set in ways. What I'm more interested in is an act of data dramatization with these immersive mediums, because not only visualizing the patterns in the data becomes critical, but it suggests that we need to develop emotional and dramatic relationships to that content in order to start to feel things like empathy, or to start to understand how ourselves, our own bodies, our own practices and behaviors are complicit in a lot of the systems and problems that we're seeing around us. So I think there's real power in investing in these really, really complex and nuanced narratives, and using the aesthetic and narrative practices of XR to draw people into emotional engagement with these issues, and in a way kind of cut through the complexity of some of these really complex stories, so that people can develop meaningful responses to them.
It reminds me of something like there's multiple studies that shows that people are less likely to believe data and facts than they are to believe a story. So it's like what he says about dramatization of data is like, how can we convey, how can we bring important, relevant data sets to the general public, knowing that they are unlikely to understand them, not understand on an intellectual standpoint, but really understand the consequences this data has on the world and themselves. But however, if we transform this into a story, then suddenly it makes sense. It's just like it comes down to us, gathering around the bonfire, and this is how we've communicated since ever. And this is how it's like through the stories and through storytelling, knowledge and skills and all this thing has been passed from generation to generation. So we are hardwired to learning and understanding our reality through storytelling better than just data, just facts. And I think this is even more relevant in this post-truth area that we're in, where truth that is not so much data anymore. I mean, the belief in truth, but it's more through again stories. So I think it's really interesting what he's saying about, okay, we've got interesting data sets, we've got things that we want to convey. How can we embed them in a storytelling approach to bring them to the general public?
It feels to me that there is a huge kind of crisis which we're on the verge here in this conversation of thinking about, which is, on the one hand, we want to tell personal stories that people can relate to, but we maybe also want people to be aware of the truth that data are telling us, some of which are kind of need urgent responses to, and yet data can be drowned out quite often by a convincing narrative.
Well, I think that usually the straightforward approach to facts and data doesn't really work anymore. But if we create emotional stories, then we can literally like prepare people for the data, or we can prime them. We can make, especially if we make it a personal experience. Well, that was a whole strategy behind the key. Is like I was tasked with making a refugee story, and we've seen tons of them, and we've seen tons of VR experience about refugee story. And we switch on the TV and we see news about the refugee crisis, and we just have those giant emotional walls, firewalls around us, that it's very hard to connect with people, to make them connect emotionally to refugee stories, just because we've seen some, we've been bombarded with those stories, and it's not that we don't care, it's just that it's just too much. There's nothing, and we feel hopeless. We feel like there's nothing we can do. And so hence the key, which is a completely metaphorical approach to a refugee. We have no idea. We are living the emotion. We're not living facts of a refugee journey. We're living, we are feeling the emotions of what this is what a refugee feels like when how to escape. You have 10 minutes to escape from your house and there is only so much you can take with you. What do you pick? What do you choose when you leave in a hurry? To the escaping from danger, to endless waiting in refugee camp, and to relocating to a new country which you don't even understand the language or the social. So we took those emotions and we put them in a metaphorical, poetic tale. And after you've been through the journey, you felt those emotions for yourself. That's when, at the end of the experience, we explain what it's about and we present actual data. So at the end of the experience, people have data such as, all right, the average waiting time in refugee camp is 26 years. All right. So now you and suddenly you feel for yourself what it means to wait, to be in limbo for 26 years. Because you've had a little glimpse of it during the experience. Well, if I had presented that fact to you directly, you'll be like, oh, wow, that's terrible. But you wouldn't be affected by it. You'd be just like, oh, that sucks. And so, yeah, so through, bringing emotional journeys and emotional storytelling from the film industry and using environmental, spatial storytelling or virtual reality, we can actually convey the emotional weight of data to people if it's done the right way.
Liam.
Yeah, I mean, I included in my intro one of our postgraduate students' games, Where Turtles Fly, which is based in director Andre's home city of Beirut, which is actually the city with the highest population of refugees anywhere in the world. And the way that he created that game was by going to Beirut with a drone and his own camera and meticulously documenting parts of the city where refugee populations exist, and use those photographs through a process of photogrammetry, translating them into super accurate and precise three-dimensional environments of the city, and then asking the audience to take on the role as a player of a young refugee boy navigating that city, fighting against the forces of the city that is doing its best to try and push them out. A city that doesn't want them, a population that stigmatizes those same refugees, and kind of playing that role is really about trying to connect people into that context and those stories. And in many ways, like I think it's Faulkner's notion that fiction is often the best form of fact. There's facts embedded in that narrative experience, that game experience. Literally, the environments you're in are real environments of Beirut. But I think, the transformation of them into a game space, building gameplay, and then there's a whole lot of surreal elements that kind of take you on this emotional journey with this young refugee boy, are really what are behind the attempt to connect people to that issue in a way that just seeing another boat has capsized in the Mediterranean. It's so easy just to kind of gloss over and forget about the humanity and the tragedy in that moment when we hear it presented through the objective lens of traditional journalism. So I don't know, I think there's real potential in this kind of hybrid space between documentary and fiction to start to address some of the crises that we have in the world right now. And we've seen, certainly in America, the context of both Celine and I are that facts no longer matter. If people understood facts, we wouldn't be in this horrific situation we find ourselves in 4 years after a Trump election. The fact of an election win is decidedly ignored And when even Fox News admits it, everyone rushes to even more right-wing conspiracy theory news mediums, not because they are not because they don't understand the facts, but because they don't want to. And people retreat into their own fictions quite willfully. So as storytellers, that puts us in a very important position to tell the right kinds of stories and to create the right kinds of fictions.
The virtual world, the digital world, and the physical world, and when those points of connection work is often when there's a kind of breakthrough. How do you see, each of you, that connection working now, but also how it might go forward into the future, the relationship between, the virtual worlds and the physical worlds?
At the moment, we think of VR and AR as being kind of separate things. Really, VR has arrived before AR because they're just more technical issues to solve with augmented reality, just in terms of machine vision, being able to accurately read and compute physical space in order to accurately insert digital objects within it. But really, they're just two ends of a spectrum. And soon they're going to collapse together, and we'll be able to just dial up or down the opacity through which we see the real world. Either, on a Friday night, we just want to tune out, so we dial down the physical world around us and immerse ourselves in season 12 of The Mandalorian. Or if we're late for a bus in the morning and we're running through a dense city, we dial up the world and see a kind of a wayfinding route laid over in front of us. So these kind of digital experiences that now we kind of actively have to put on or go into will very soon just be another layer to the world, in the same way that rain across the city is just another embedded layer of experience. So it's not enough to be talking about them as some kind of a digital experience versus a physical experience. It's all just one collected soupy mass of experience, both of which have real consequence and truth effects. And again, that means that we have the potential to be curators of our own realities in really powerful ways. As creators, we're all kind of architects of new kinds of urban and spatial experiences. And that's a powerful place to be.
We've talked a lot about the kind of the modes and the techniques and the possibilities and the architecture of spatial storytelling. But what are the stories, because you said it's less about identity or characters, that there's a slightly different way of understanding that. You mentioned participant rather than audience. And you've also rejected, I think rightly, some of the kind of filmic models of narrative that have a particular, like a 3-act structure, a hero's journey or whatever. So what form should we be looking for, and what subjects or ways of thinking about narratives do you think spatial storytelling needs to address in the next few years?
That's a very big question, but there's always something that I like to think about. Apart from the present time where we are right now, and we are in a space, 99.99% of realities is memories of past times and past places. And what's interesting is, how do we remember memories, how do we interpret memories, and how the brain classifies and handles memories of places we've been and people we've met and experiences we've learned from. And what's interesting is virtual reality is actually considered by the brain like a lived memory. So it's not classified in the brain in the same place as memories of a book or memories as a movie. It's actually classified as a physically lived experience. The brain doesn't know the difference between VR and reality on the subconscious level. And so that means that's why VR is very successful at being used to treat PTSDs and phobias. And, it's just because the way the brain understands those experiences. And so obviously there is the question about what kind of stories, and this is a very vast question, but I really like to think of anything VR as dreams. I classify them as, because actually dreams are also lived memories. We are learning, we are processing a lot of things in our brain through a dreamscape and dreams. And so creating a VR experience means you are creating a lived memory for your participants, your future participants, and that comes with big responsibility. Of course, big power comes big responsibility. And so any story, like people ask me what kind of stories is good for VR, not good for VR. Like, I don't have the answer to that question. Any story or anything really, it's just a matter of like, how do we present it? How do you shape it? And try to think of it as, what if you had to create, you're kind of a god and you have to create a dream for people? What would that look like? Or create a memory for people? What would that look like? And very quickly, when people think of it that way, they quickly go to world building. Instead of doing the 3-act structure, again, the storytelling approach, they go the architectural approach, the game approach, which I believe is a much better approach. So that's my 2 cents.
So there are 20 projects in the CreativeXR digital showcase, 5 of which have been supported by the StoryFutures Academy. What is the one thing that you would say to those makers, some of whom are very experienced, some of whom are working in this field for the first time? What one thing do you think they should think about as they take their projects forward?
What I find is often the most important thing with virtual reality is simplicity is key. So sometimes we try to do too much. Well, the medium is very overwhelming, right? Putting people in VR headsets, teleporting them to a different space, and kind of like taking over their sense of vision and their sense of hearing. It's very overwhelming. And sometimes we try to put too much, whether it's too much visual clues, too much talking dialogue and voiceover, too much information, and asking too much from our audiences. And sometimes it become quickly, like so many buttons we have to push with the controllers, and what am I supposed to do? And I feel stupid, and I don't want to feel stupid. I want to, feel empowered. So I guess my number one advice is look at your project. Really try to put yourself in the shoes of a participant who maybe has never done VR before, or is not a gamer, or is not very used to it. Like, how would that person react? And really try to narrow down everything to the essence of your project. So what is the emotional state you want them to be in, and how can you build that emotional state, and get rid of all the unnecessary stuff that might just become just this constant all the stimuli coming that will take them away from that emotional state you want them to be in. So simplify, make it super simple, make it easy, and sometimes you'll see it's more efficient that way.
Thank you. Liam?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. The idea of distilling complexity, I think is a fantastic suggestion. I guess related to that would then also be a question of audience, and I guess that would be my piece of advice, would be to really focus on understanding and being clear about who the audience for your work might be. And these are mediums that aren't yet widely distributed in most cases. Immersive mediums like again rely on computational capacity of the player. They rely on the invigilation or the number of stations in a gallery and how fast they are able to move people through an experience. Like really thinking through who you're trying to talk to with your project. How do you connect with them? What platforms are going to be most appropriate to reach them? Both in terms of kind of advertising that the work exists, distributing the work, but also conceptually, like connecting to that person on an emotional and narrative level. I think that's really key, to not see these things as just like, oh, I want the public to see it, but rather to be much more aware of the complexities of audience outreach. I think that's really fundamental.
So thank you both. Thank you, Celine Tricart and Liam Young, for a fantastic conversation, masterclass, which has really changed the way that I've thought about spatial storytelling, and particularly spatial storytelling in VR. It's been an honor.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for the invitation, everyone. Great to talk to you, Celine.